The plantation did not speak of it at first. It never did. Plantations survived on silence as much as they survived on labor. What was written in the ledger mattered. What circulated in whispers did not, at least not officially. But even ledgers have limits. On this plantation, tucked between river bends and dense trees in the deep south, the births had begun to trouble the margins. Not because children were being born, that was expected. Encouraged even. Enslaved women were counted not only by strength but by increase. What unsettled them was how some of the children looked. The first baby was dismissed as coincidence. A lighter complexion, softer hair, eyes that did not match the mother's. The midwife noticed. The other women noticed. The overseer did not ask questions, because asking would require answers he was not prepared to hear. So the child was recorded. Federal assigned a future like any other. Then another was born. And another. Years passed and the pattern refused to fade. Every so often, never all at once, never predictably, a baby would arrive that did not fit cleanly into the categories the plantation depended on. Their skin was lighter than expected. Their features complicated. Their existence quietly disruptive. The women noticed first. They always did. They bathed the babies, delivered them, wrapped them in cloth. They saw the contrast clearly against their own dark skin, the same skin that had been punished, sold, and worked for generations. They did not say the word why. They knew better. Questions on plantations were dangerous not because they were wrong, but because they were correct. The overseer noticed eventually. Not because of morality. Because of order. Plantations required narratives to function. Clear lines. Clear roles. White owners. Black labor. Children that could be placed neatly within that system. These babies complicated that clarity. He mentioned it once, cautiously, to the master of the house. "There's been talk," he said. The master looked up from his desk, annoyed more than curious. "Talk of what?" "Some of the newborns. Their appearance." The master frowned, then waved a dismissive hand. "You see problems where there aren't any. Children take after distant ancestors." The explanation was convenient. It allowed the system to continue uninterrupted. But convenience does not erase observation. By the time the fifth baby was born with unmistakably mixed features, even silence grew tense. The enslaved women whispered at night, not in outrage but in recognition. They did not need explanation spelled out. They lived close enough to power to understand its habits. They knew which men moved freely at night. They knew which cabins were entered without permission. They knew which cries were ignored. Still no one asked why. Not because they didn't know, but because knowing aloud would destroy the fragile balance that allowed them to survive. The mistress of the house noticed too. She noticed the way her husband lingered longer during inspections. The way certain women were reassigned to work closer to the house. The way the babies were never spoken of directly, yet always seemed to change the air in a room. She did not confront him. On plantations, confrontation was not a tool women were encouraged to use. Instead, she turned her attention to control. The children were watched carefully. Their upbringing monitored. Their futures discussed in hushed, strategic terms. Some were kept close. Some were sold early. Some disappeared into other counties before questions could take root. The pattern was not mercy. It was management. Among the enslaved women was one who noticed something else. Her name was Eliza. She had lived on the plantation long enough to understand its rhythms. Long enough to know when patterns meant nothing, and when they meant everything. Eliza did not give birth to one of the lighter-skinned children. Not yet. But she noticed that the women who did shared something else besides appearance in their babies. They were not the strongest workers. They were not the loudest. They were the ones assigned closest to the house. Eliza understood the danger of that realization. She stopped speaking to those women openly. Not out of rejection, but protection. Association could be fatal when truth hovered too close. Then one winter Eliza became pregnant. It was not unusual. She had already borne children before. Children who had been sold south, children whose faces had blurred into memory to survive the loss. This pregnancy felt no different at first. But as months passed, the women began to watch her more closely. Not with suspicion. With fear. When the baby was born, the room went silent. The midwife froze. The child in Eliza's arms was unmistakable. Light skin. Fine hair. Features that told a story no one had permission to tell. Eliza looked down at her child and understood immediately. Not just what had happened, but what would happen next. She did not scream. She did not accuse. She did not collapse into grief. She had learned from the others. Instead, she held her baby quietly and waited. The plantation reacted with efficiency. The overseer arrived within hours. The mistress was informed. The child was examined not as a human being but as a problem to be solved. No one asked Eliza how it had happened. They did not need to. They discussed where the baby would go, how long it should stay, whether its existence posed risk. The child was allowed to live. That, in itself, was not kindness. It was calculation. Eliza returned to work weeks later, carrying something heavier than exhaustion. She carried knowledge. Not secret knowledge, but confirmed knowledge. The kind that cannot be undone once seen clearly. She realized then that the plantation was not confused by the babies. It was threatened by what acknowledging them would require. Acknowledgement would mean admitting that power did not only exploit labor, but bodies. That ownership was not metaphorical. That the system sustained itself through violations it refused to name. So instead it pretended the babies were accidents, coincidences, anomalies, and Eliza understood her role now. She was no longer just a laborer. She was evidence. And evidence on plantations had a way of disappearing. She began to watch carefully, to listen differently, to prepare without revealing intention. Because she knew something the plantation hoped no one would ever say out loud. These babies were not mysteries. They were messages. And one day someone would ask why. Silence on the plantation was not emptiness. It was structure. It lived in the pauses between questions, in the way eyes slid away at the wrong moment, in the rules no one had ever written down yet everyone obeyed. Silence was how the plantation protected itself, from scrutiny, from accountability, from truth. After Eliza's child was born, the silence changed shape. It grew tighter. Women stopped whispering even at night. Midwives spoke only in necessities. Children were shushed more quickly, pulled closer when strangers passed. The air carried a new alertness, as if the ground itself had learned to listen. The plantation responded the way it always did when threatened, not by stopping what caused the threat, but by controlling who noticed. Women assigned near the house were rotated more frequently now. No one stayed too long in one place. Familiarity, the overseer understood, bred patterns. Patterns bred questions. The babies continued to be born. Not often enough to alarm outsiders. Just often enough to sustain the quiet disturbance beneath the surface. Some were born lighter. Some darker but unmistakably different. Some carried features that could not be explained away by distance or ancestry without strain. Each time the same ritual followed. The child was acknowledged briefly. Then redirected, sold, relocated, absorbed into some other corner of the system where the story would not be told again. No records connected them. That too was deliberate. Eliza watched all of it. She did not ask why. She already knew. What she began to understand instead was how the silence worked. It required participation. Not active agreement, but restraint. People survived by not connecting dots out loud. By treating individual events as isolated, even when their minds recognized patterns. Silence demanded constant discipline. And the cost of breaking it was severe. One woman did. Her name was Margaret. She was older than most, her voice worn thin from years of labor. She had delivered 3 of the babies that unsettled the plantation. She had seen enough. One night, after too much exhaustion and too little fear left, she spoke. "They keep pretending like we don't see," she said, her voice sharp in the darkness of the quarters. "Like we don't know." The room went still. No one answered. Not because they disagreed, but because speaking next would make the danger real. The following week, Margaret was sold. No explanation. No announcement. Just gone. The message was clear. Silence was not optional. It was enforced. Eliza understood then that the plantation did not fear discovery from outside. It feared recognition from within. If the enslaved people named the truth collectively, even without resistance, it would change how they understood their own suffering. And that was unacceptable. So the plantation adjusted its methods. Women suspected of attracting attention were moved farther from the house. Others were brought closer. The rotation continued, disguising cause as routine. The master avoided the nursery entirely now. The mistress took over supervision, positioning herself as guardian of order. She never spoke of the babies directly, but she kept records, private ones. Eliza saw her once, seated at a desk late at night, reading through lists that never matched the official ledger. Counting. The mistress was not counting children. She was counting risk. Eliza's own child grew quietly. He was kept close to her, not out of mercy but because his existence was still under evaluation. He was too young to sell without drawing notice, too visible to ignore. He watched. Much like the child Hannah had once born on another plantation far away, Eliza's son absorbed everything. He learned early which adults avoided looking at him, which ones watched too closely. He learned when silence meant safety. Eliza did not teach him fear. She taught him awareness. Listen first, she whispered when he began to speak. Then decide what matters. The plantation, however, was not content with passive control. They needed resolution. Too many anomalies weakened authority. Even unspoken, they disturbed the logic that justified ownership. The overseer proposed a solution. Sell them young, he suggested, before questions grow. The mistress considered this. Selling early reduced risk, but it also scattered evidence unpredictably. Children sold to different regions might grow up asking their own questions elsewhere. She wanted containment. Her solution was subtler. The next mixed-featured baby born was kept longer than usual. Watched closely. Integrated deliberately into plantation life. Presented as proof that nothing was wrong, that appearances could be managed. The child became a test. Would proximity normalize what had unsettled them? Would silence hold? Eliza saw through it immediately. This child was not meant to live freely. It was meant to be absorbed into the lie. As the child grew, workers were instructed to treat him no differently. To avoid comment. To correct anyone who lingered too long on his appearance. The effort was exhausting. Maintaining silence required energy, attention. Policing not just behavior but thought. And cracks began to show. Children whispered questions adults could not answer. Outsiders, traders, visitors, noticed inconsistencies and raised eyebrows that lingered a second too long. The mistress found herself defending explanations she no longer believed. The system was still intact, but it was strained. Eliza sensed that the plantation stood at a threshold, not of rebellion but of exposure. Silence, stretched too thin, becomes noise. One afternoon, as Eliza worked near the edge of the fields, she overheard a trader speaking to the overseer. "Funny place," the man said casually. "Stories travel." The overseer stiffened. "What stories?" The trader shrugged. "About children. About patterns." The word landed heavily. Patterns. The plantation had spent years denying their existence. Now someone from outside had named them without fear. That night, Eliza held her son closer than usual. She knew what came next. When systems built on silence feel exposed, they do not confess. They eliminate. And Eliza understood something with terrifying clarity. The plantation would soon act, not quietly, not gradually, but decisively. And when it did, it would not matter whether questions were asked. Only who remained when the answers could no longer be hidden. The plantation did not wait long. Systems built on silence can tolerate discomfort, but they cannot tolerate attention. Once the trader spoke the word patterns, the balance shifted. What had once been managed internally now risked moving beyond the boundaries of the land. And that made it dangerous. The master called a meeting that night, quiet, closed, limited to those who understood what was truly at stake. The overseer. The mistress. Two men whose job titles were never written down but whose presence was always felt when order needed restoring. Eliza did not hear the conversation. She did not need to. By morning, the signs were everywhere. Work assignments were reshuffled abruptly. Women who had given birth to mixed-featured children were separated, sent to distant fields, placed under stricter supervision. Midwives were warned, explicitly, about discretion. One was told she would be replaced if she misunderstood her role. The role everyone knew was not care. It was containment. The child the mistress had chosen to keep, the experiment, was brought forward more often now. Displayed subtly during inspections. Dressed better. Fed more carefully. Treated as proof that nothing was wrong. "See," the plantation seemed to say, "nothing here is out of order." But order maintained through denial is fragile. The other enslaved children noticed the difference immediately. They noticed how the boy was watched. How adults hesitated around him. How his presence changed conversations without anyone acknowledging why. Children are not fooled by silence. They simply lack the words adults use to disguise it. Eliza's son noticed too. "Why do they stare?" he asked one evening. Eliza did not answer directly. "Some people don't like mirrors," she said instead. He considered that quietly. The plantation's next move was less subtle. A group of women, those whose children fit the pattern too clearly, were sold in quick succession. Not publicly, not dramatically, just efficiently, as if removing inconvenient lines from a page. The babies were included. Sold young enough to forget or old enough to survive transport. The goal was simple: disrupt continuity. No continuity, no pattern. But the plantation underestimated one thing. Memory does not require records. It requires witnesses. Eliza became one. She watched the wagons leave. She noted which women were taken, which children were removed. She listened to the lies told afterward, that they had been transferred, that they had gone willingly, that it was for the best. She said nothing. Silence, she understood now, could also be weaponized against those who relied on it. The mistress began sleeping even less. Her authority, once absolute within the domestic sphere, now felt exposed. She had attempted to manage truth through control, but truth was not static. It moved through people, through glances, through absence. She confronted her husband at last. "You cannot keep pretending this isn't happening," she said sharply. He did not deny it. "I can," he replied. "And I will." "That traitor will say nothing," he cut in. "He wants business, not conflict." "But others?" "There will always be others," he said. "That's why we manage, not explain." The mistress understood then that his solution was not resolution. It was escalation. The plantation would not correct itself. It would protect itself harder. The next inspection was harsher than any before. Workers were lined up longer. Children separated from mothers. Questions asked not for answers but for reactions. The overseer watched Eliza closely. She had not been sold. That was not an oversight. It was a test. They wanted to see how far knowledge could exist without becoming action. Eliza understood this too. She kept her posture neutral, her face unreadable. She answered questions politely and briefly. She did not look at the other women whose children had been taken. But inside something had changed. The plantation believed that erasing the pattern would restore order. Eliza realized the opposite was true. Erasure confirmed the pattern's existence. If nothing was wrong, nothing would need to be removed. That logic, once seen, could not be unseen. Even among those who never spoke of it, something had shifted. Compliance remained, but conviction did not. Work was done, but without the same internal submission. Instructions were followed, but no longer absorbed as truth. The plantation had lost its ability to define reality unquestioned. And that loss unsettled everyone who depended on it. One evening, Eliza was called aside by a man who worked the far fields, someone she rarely spoke to. "They're moving more people," he said quietly. "Soon." "Who?" she asked. "Anyone who knows too much." Eliza nodded. That night, she made a decision, not sudden, not reckless, but inevitable. She began to prepare. Not for escape, for survival beyond silence. She started by teaching her son differently. Not just when to be quiet, but when silence itself was being used against him. She taught him to notice contradictions, to remember faces, names, movements. "Don't collect everything," she told him. "Collect what connects." He listened carefully. The plantation continued its efforts to erase evidence. But erasure leaves gaps. And gaps invite attention. By the time another outsider arrived, this one less discreet than the last, the plantation's explanations began to fray. The overseer found himself repeating justifications that no longer sounded convincing even to himself. "How many?" the visitor asked casually one afternoon. "How many what?" the overseer replied. "You know." The overseer did not answer. That silence was louder than any confession. Eliza felt the tension rise like heat before a storm. The plantation was approaching a moment it could no longer manage quietly. And when systems built on silence reach that point, they choose one of two paths: reform or force. Eliza knew which one this place would choose. She held her son close that night and whispered something she had never said before. "Remember everything," she told him. even what they try to erase. He nodded, understanding more than she wished he had to. The plantation believed it could remove the pattern by scattering its evidence. It did not yet understand that patterns, once recognized, no longer depend on visibility to exist. They depend on memory. And memory, unlike people, could not be sold away so easily. The shift did not announce itself. It never did. Force on plantations rarely arrived as chaos. It arrived as procedure, tightened rules, sharpened routines, authority exercised without explanation. When denial could no longer hold the truth in place, the plantation did not confess. It consolidated. The first sign was movement. Not escape, removal. Cabins were reassigned overnight. Families separated under the language of efficiency. Mothers woke to find children moved to different quarters for work. Men were transferred without warning, scattered across fields where no one knew their names well enough to ask questions. The plantation was thinning its memory. The overseer called it reorganization. Eliza called it preparation. Inspections became daily. Not for productivity, but for behavior. A contact lingered too long? Corrected. Silence held too firmly? Question. Any deviation from expected submission was noted. Fear, the overseer believed, would restore order faster than explanation ever could. The mistress oversaw the domestic sphere with renewed intensity. She personally approved which women worked near the house, which children were allowed inside, which were kept distant, invisible, erased from sight as thoroughly as possible. The experiment child, the one they had tried to normalize, was no longer presented openly. He had failed his purpose. Rather than dissolving the pattern, he had sharpened it. People noticed his absence immediately. Absence, once again, spoke louder than presence. Eliza sensed the danger tightening around her like a drawn cord. She was still there, still unremoved. That, she knew, meant she was being watched, not because she had acted but because she had not. In systems of control, inaction after recognition is suspicious. They were waiting for her to make a mistake. They did not have to wait long. One afternoon, during a routine inspection, a young girl asked a question out loud. Why do some babies look different? The question did not come from Eliza's son. It came from a child too young to understand consequence. The air froze. The overseer turned slowly. Who said that? He demanded. No one answered. The girl's mother pulled her close, trembling. But it was too late. The question had been spoken. The plantation reacted instantly, not to the child but to the breach. Work was halted. People were separated. The question was treated not as curiosity, but as contamination. That evening, 3 families were sold. No explanation given. The next day the girl was gone. Force had replaced denial completely. Eliza understood then that silence was no longer enough. The plantation was not trying to hide the truth anymore. It was trying to punish awareness itself. That night, Eliza spoke to her son with a seriousness that left no room for comfort. You are not safe here, she said plainly. He nodded. Not with fear. With recognition. I know, he replied. The calm in his voice frightened her more than panic would have. She began preparing in earnest, not hastily, not visibly, but deliberately. She stopped sharing information. Stopped listening openly. She observed instead, guard rotations, timing, moments when supervision thinned. She knew escape for herself was unlikely. But escape was not her goal. Preservation was. The plantation meanwhile accelerated. More women were moved. More children reassigned. Midwives were replaced with men who followed orders without hesitation. Births were monitored closely not for health but for outcome. If a baby showed signs that complicated the narrative, decisions were made immediately. No waiting. No ambiguity. The system had decided. Evidence would not be allowed to accumulate again. Eliza watched as one woman was taken away just days after giving birth. The baby was removed first. The mother screamed. Force does not silence pain. It amplifies it. But the plantation did not care. Pain, when isolated, was manageable. What it feared was shared understanding. The overseer confronted Eliza directly at last. You've been quiet, he said. She met his gaze briefly, then lowered her eyes. I do my work. Yes, he said slowly. You do. He circled her, assessing. You notice things, he continued. I don't like that. Eliza said nothing. I need to know, he pressed, whether you intend to be a problem. The question was not rhetorical. Eliza understood the danger of answering too quickly. I intend to survive, she said. The overseer studied her, then smiled thinly. So does the plantation. That was the moment Eliza understood fully. There would be no return to balance. The plantation had chosen force not as a temporary measure, but as a permanent posture. It would erase, remove, punish, and scatter until no one could see the pattern clearly enough to name it. But it was already too late. People had seen. Children had noticed. Memory had formed. And memory does not require permission to endure. Eliza began to act, not loudly, not dramatically, but decisively. She taught her son not just to remember, but to recognize moments. When something changes suddenly, she told him, it means someone is afraid. She taught him which paths were avoided by patrols, which sounds meant movement versus threat, which adults could be trusted with silence. She did not say the word escape. Words have weight. Instead, she spoke of readiness. The plantation felt the tension too. Force creates compliance, but also resistance. Even when resistance is invisible. The mistress noticed fewer eyes lowering when she entered rooms. More stillness. Less reaction. People were no longer absorbing authority. They were enduring it. And endurance without belief hollows power from the inside. The final act of force came without warning. One morning, Eliza was ordered to present her son for reassignment. No explanation. No destination named. She understood immediately. This was removal. Not sale. Not relocation. Containment. She did not cry. She did not plead. She nodded and agreed. That compliance saved her time. That night she prepared. Not everything. Just enough. At dawn, before the overseer arrived, Eliza made her choice. It was not the choice she wanted. It was the only one left. She whispered instructions to her son, clear, precise, final. You walk until the trees thin, she said. You don't look back. You don't speak unless spoken to. You remember everything I taught you. What about you? He asked. She smiled softly. I will remain, she said. So you don't have to. When the plantation realized what had happened, it reacted with fury. Dogs. Men. Orders shouted into the morning air. But Eliza did not run. She stayed. She absorbed their rage. Because force requires a target. And Eliza chose to be it. As she endured the consequences they delivered, she held one truth firmly in her mind. The plantation had used force to protect its lie. But lies require presence to survive. And something essential had already left. The plantation believed the moment had passed. Once the shouting faded, once the dogs returned confused, once the sun rose high enough to force work to resume, those in power told themselves that order had been restored. Another incident absorbed. Another disruption contained. Force had been applied. Therefore control remained. That was the belief. But force does not erase memory. It sharpens it. Eliza was punished but not destroyed. That in itself unsettled the overseer. Public execution would have drawn too much attention. Sale would have raised questions. Instead, she was kept, visible enough to serve as warning, alive enough to endure. She returned to work altered, not broken. Her silence was no longer fear-based. It was deliberate. People noticed. They noticed the way she moved through the fields with calm precision. The way she avoided conversations without appearing suspicious. The way she listened, not for gossip but for patterns. She had become something the plantation did not know how to manage. Not rebellious. Where? The plantation responded by increasing pressure everywhere else. Rules multiplied. Curfews tightened. Children were separated earlier. Information was controlled aggressively. But the effect was the opposite of what they intended. Fear scattered people, but memory gathered them. Small moments began to link together. A woman noticed that only certain women were moved. A man realized that children were reassigned based on appearance. A midwife recognized that records never matched reality. No one spoke of it openly. But everyone knew something was being hidden. The plantation's strength had always depended on the idea that its order was natural, God-given, unquestionable. Now it felt engineered. And engineering requires maintenance. The mistress found herself issuing more instructions than before, correcting behavior that had once corrected itself, watching faces for reactions instead of assuming obedience. She was exhausted. Her authority, once effortless, now required constant reinforcement. The overseer grew harsher. Not because people resisted openly, but because they no longer responded internally. Orders were followed, yes, but without the quiet submission that had once accompanied them. The plantation had become loud. Commands echoed. Punishments increased. Surveillance expanded. But meaning drained away. Eliza watched all of it from the margins. She had accepted the cost of her choice fully. She did not expect reunion. She did not expect vindication. What she did not expect was influence. People began to sit near her again, not to ask questions, but to feel steadier in her presence. Children gravitated toward her, sensing something calm in a place built on fear. She never told her story. Stories attract attention. Instead, she spoke in fragments. Notice what changes suddenly. Notice what disappears first. Notice who benefits when silence is enforced. The plantation tried to erase continuity. But continuity had already shifted inward. The idea that mixed-race babies were accidents had lost credibility, not because anyone challenged it aloud, but because too many people had seen too much. The plantation's explanations began to contradict themselves. One trader refused to return. Another asked too many questions. A visitor from a neighboring county commented carelessly, "Strange place you run here." The master laughed it off. But the laughter rang hollow. Even among those in power, certainty had thinned. The mistress began to avoid certain rooms, certain names, certain thoughts. She told herself that order remained intact. But order without belief is performance. And performances require audiences willing to be convinced. One evening, a child asked Eliza quietly, "Did they take him because he looked different?" Eliza did not answer directly. "They take what makes them uncomfortable," she said. The child nodded. That understanding traveled. Not as outrage, as clarity. The plantation did not collapse. That would have been too visible. Instead it decayed. Efficiency declined. Labor slowed subtly. Trust evaporated between overseers and workers. Information stopped flowing upward. Control became heavy. And heavy systems crack under their own weight. Eliza aged. Her body weakened, but her presence remained grounded. She had become something the plantation never anticipated, a living reminder that force could silence voices, but not understanding. One morning years later, the mistress passed Eliza in the yard. For a brief moment, their eyes met. There was no hatred there, only recognition. The mistress understood then what had been lost. Not a child, not control, but the illusion that the plantation could contain everything it created. Mixed-race babies had not been the problem. They had been the evidence. Evidence that ownership was never clean, that boundaries were never real, that power depended on denial more than dominance. The plantation had tried to erase that truth with force. Instead, it had distributed it, quietly, irreversibly. Eliza never learned what became of her son. But she knew this. Wherever he was, he carried knowledge that could not be unlearned. And knowledge, once moved beyond the reach of force, becomes legacy. The plantation outlived Eliza. That was not unusual. Plantations were built to endure people. They replaced bodies the way fields replaced crops. Season after season, loss folded neatly into routine. When Eliza finally grew too weak to work, she was moved to the edges of usefulness, then to the edges of attention. No announcement marked the shift. She simply became someone others stepped around. And yet, long after her strength faded, the thing she had protected remained. Not the child, but what the child represented. Years passed. Owners changed. The overseer who had once watched her so closely was replaced by another man who inherited rules without understanding why they existed. The mistress aged into a quieter authority, less certain, more withdrawn. The plantation still functioned, but it no longer felt inevitable. Small fractures appeared where certainty once lived. Children questioned assignments sooner. Workers remembered past explanations and noticed when new ones contradicted them. Midwives passed knowledge without naming it, ensuring patterns were not forgotten even when they were officially denied. The plantation never spoke of mixed-race babies again. That silence, too, was telling. When something vanishes completely from conversation, it has usually become too dangerous to deny. Eliza's son never returned. No rumor confirmed his fate. But rumors are not how survival is measured. What mattered was that something had moved beyond the plantation's control. A truth had escaped. And truth, once outside the system that created it, no longer needs protection from within. The plantation's greatest failure was not that outsiders might discover its secret. It was that those forced to live inside it had already understood. They had seen how silence functioned. They had watched force replace denial. They had learned that power depended not on righteousness but on agreement. And agreement could be withdrawn quietly. Long after Eliza was gone, the plantation still operated, but it no longer defined reality as completely as it once had. It explained more. It punished faster. It reacted instead of assuming. Those were signs of weakness, not strength. The children Eliza had taught, directly or indirectly, carried her lessons forward. Not as rebellion but as awareness. They knew what questions not to ask out loud. And they knew which truths could survive without words. The plantation had tried to erase a pattern. Instead, it had taught people how to recognize one. That knowledge endured. That was the failure. Not exposure, but survival. Because systems built on silence are not destroyed when their secrets are revealed. They are undone when the people inside them stop believing the silence is natural. And that belief, once broken, never fully returns.